My name is Jeremy Walton, and here's 5 tips for B-roll success. Let's go! It's 2020, can you believe it? 2019 was an interesting year, but I think 2020 will be even better. And to start the new year off right, I'm heading to one of my favorite spots to get something to eat when I'm in the Twin Cities. And more importantly for 2020, let's step up our B-roll game. By the way, this is a rental, so there's no tint on the window, but right now it's snowing, so it's overcast, so I think we'll be good. So what is B-roll? Long story short, it's the footage you intercut with your primary footage, or what you'll see on YouTube is an entire sequence of B-roll shots. Some people hate it because it does get overused, but good B-roll should enhance your story. And B-roll ain't going nowhere. So let's make it better and dismiss the bad rap it gets. A lot of B-roll is used for time, as in passing time or travel, moving from one place to another. Movies use it all the time, and if you haven't seen it, check out the movie The Commuter, starring Liam Neeson. I wouldn't consider this B-roll, but during the opening credits that usually show establishing shots, what a creative way to show the passage of time. That's entertaining. Try applying an idea like this to your footage, and I'm sure people won't be complaining about your B-roll. First up on my list that I want you to consider is the actual amount of time your B-roll sequence runs. Your best bet is to cut it down to as short as possible. Now that might mean deleting some of your favorite shots, but that's being a filmmaker. But don't worry, you can always save it for later. You don't have to show every single detail, just short, entertaining clips that launch you into the next sequence. Now this might sound like a simple tip, but we're all victims of trying to show too much. People's attention span is short, so you have to remember that what was I talking about? Where am I going?
Turn right onto Bedford Street Southeast, then turn right onto...
Wow, it's a little snowy out. Oh, it's in my eyes. That's better. I guess I'll take over for now to keep this thing moving along. Oh, by the way, notice anything different? New paint on the walls, cleared the shelves, and that's a work in progress, and a few other things I'll get to in another video. Next up, I'm gonna combine 2 tips. You'll see why shortly, and that's going to be movement and camera lenses. Starting with movement, that can be your actual camera moving or something moving in the frame. Shooting in the city, that'll most likely be cars or people. The one thing you have to remember is what your lenses will do depending on what you're shooting and the effect you're trying to get. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start with traffic and use a 35mm lens. You can see the cars are moving, but with a wide-angle lens, the movement is slow because the cars have a longer distance to travel across the screen. If we slap on a longer lens like an 85mm, we narrow the field of view and the traffic intensifies because everything is compressed and the travel time is limited. So if you want a lot of movement to keep your B-roll a little more alive, try using a longer lens. This can also be good for camera movement as well, since moving from point A to point B with a wide angle really doesn't take a whole lot of movement. On a longer lens, moving from point A to point B is much more dramatic, but hopefully your autofocus can keep up, or you need to manually nail focus. A longer lens and movement will also help your transitions or hide cuts if that's what you're going for. Now back to the wide angle lens. If I use it, I want to make good use of it. One way is an establishing shot. This can also come from a drone as well. These movements will be minimal, so make sure what you're shooting makes up for the static shot. Most likely it'll be something that sets the scene and kicks off your story. A wide-angle lens is also good for those dramatic, slow-motion walking scenes. I'm a fan. If it's your B-roll story, it's nice to actually be in it. I usually have someone with me, but if you don't, set up your camera and do a walk-by. Or what I usually do is get some footage of my shoes at least once. And yes, I know my shoes are untied. Trust me, I know. This was just a habit that developed over the years. I'm much better at tying my shoes after having to replace so many shoelaces. But I still like it during my B-roll. Why, you ask? Movement. I love the slow motion of my laces whipping back and forth. Now there's another reason I film myself walking, and that brings me to my next tip, which is the insert shot. You could call the clip of my shoes an insert shot or possibly a cutaway, and I wouldn't be mad. I think in your B-roll sequence, or basically anytime you're shooting, you should be gathering insert shots, which in film is defined as action already covered by the master shot. I'll have to break that down in another video, but an insert shot can save you in your edit. B-roll can be all over the place. The rules are very gray, although insert shots still apply. One example would be the shot of me in the crosswalk. I could just cut away to anything really, but especially if this has to do with a lapse of time, I try to include that in my story. I do this by getting an insert of the crosswalk sign. For an insert shot, no matter what lens you're using, you want to be close. The closer the better. And using a crosswalk sign, you literally have something counting down. Subtext, people. You need to be thinking of these things while you're shooting. And trust me, some really interesting ideas will pop up when you're in the right state of mind. Whew. It's cold. My next tip I'm gonna throw at you is going to be quick but very useful. Don't forget to hit the record button. It's the little things that make a difference. Let me elaborate. Oh, God. When you're out filming, always hit the record button sooner than you think. Just start recording, then set up your shot. For example, I was setting up a static shot of a building, which turned out pretty boring, but since I was already recording, the handheld footage of me pulling focus was way more interesting. It looked planned, and no one will ever know. Same goes for finishing up a shot. Don't immediately stop recording. Depending on your transition, you may want the extra frames, and you'll never know what you'll grab. Talking about B-roll, we have to talk about slow motion. I actually did a video about what is cinematic filmmaking that definitely applies to your B-roll. So have a look, especially if you love movies like me. Who's excited for Top Gun 2? I actually think slow motion has been covered plenty of times. So let's flip it, and for my last tip, let's discuss fast motion. That usually makes me think of a time lapse or a hyperlapse. And one of my favorite things to do is mount my camera to my car and do a hyperlapse. In those cases, we're talking about making a sequence from photos. I don't want to do that. I want to speed up my footage and not just a portion of it like in a speed ramp. I've used this technique a few different times in a B-roll sequence. Once when I was in Atlanta at the Braves baseball stadium, and more recently when I was at the airport. It's something I don't see too often in this capacity, and as you can see, there's some similarities within these two shots. I'm usually passing objects. Again, I'm trying to introduce movement while contributing to my story. What I love is objects in the foreground are racing past the screen, but whatever's in the background stays focused in the frame. So to make this a much more dramatic effect, I just speed it up. We're taking an effect used a lot to show the passing of time and applying it a bit differently to mix things up. And using speed with movement, you can easily intercut this with speed ramps or whip transitions. Again, there really isn't any specific rules that you need to follow. You just want to make sure whatever you do helps support your story and keeps things moving. It doesn't always have to be super flashy. You can be subtle and still make something interesting. If you can't already tell, the sun is setting, I'm losing light, traffic is getting bad, the snowstorm is getting worse. It's time to head home. Oh, God. Someone opened the sunroof. Now it's frozen open. I'll try it. You got so lucky. These are just some of the techniques I use when shooting a B-roll sequence and apply to a lot of work I do in general. Like I mentioned, you might be tired of B-roll on YouTube. So what do you gotta do to get excited about B-roll? Whether it's story, the shots, pick something and go for it. We can talk all day about what's right or wrong and get nowhere because it really is a matter of opinion. For one person, they may like one thing while another may hate it. Getting people to keep watching is tough, so don't be afraid to try something new and be different. It's surprising how one little thing can make a big difference. Well, there you have it, 5 tips for B-roll success. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hit that like button because there's definitely more in the way. Subscribe so you don't miss out. But until then, comment below and let me know how you plan on shooting B-roll in 2020. And as for this episode, it's a wrap.